Welcome, everyone. My name is Yoon-Jung Park, and I'm the Program Director of Georgetown's Africa-China Initiative, jointly hosted by the African and Asian Studies programs at the Walsh School of Foreign Service. I also teach in African Studies and serve as Executive Director of the Chinese in Africa, Africans in China Research Network. Today's event is co-hosted by Georgetown's Initiative for U.S.-China Dialogue on Global Issues and Howard University's African Studies Center. I'm very pleased to introduce our panelists for today's event on China's foreign aid and investment in Africa. I'm going to keep these introductions brief. You can find more information about all of our speakers and our moderator on the website. Our first speaker will be Ike Fu. She is a policy analyst and program manager at Development Reimagined, specializing in African development, China-Africa relations, and development finance. She will be followed by Winslow Robertson, who is a PhD candidate in managing people and organizations at IESE Business School, researching the intersection between ideology and management. He is also founder of Calories and Rice and recently joined the board of the Chinese in Africa, Africans in China Research Network. Oyin Tarelado, or Tarella Moses, is the data analyst and database manager for the Global China Initiative at the Boston University Global Development Policy Center. And finally, we have Marina Rudyak, who is interim professor for Chinese society and economy at the University of Göttingen and co-founder of Decoding China Dictionary. Our panel today will be moderated by Professor Vanessa Opalo. Professor Opalo is an economic anthropologist and postdoctoral research fellow in the Science, Technology, and International Affairs program at Georgetown University's Walsh School of Foreign Service. Thank you all again for joining us, and I'll turn over to Vanessa. Thank you.
Hi, good morning, everyone, and welcome. First of all, I'm going to start with Yika and invite her to share a little bit about Chinese financial engagement and tools for this type of engagement with African countries, specifically focusing on BRI, or the Belt and Road Initiative. Yika, over to you.
Yes, hi everyone. Thank you, Vanessa. And I'm very pleasure to having me today. And so my name is Ike, and I'm just mentioned I'm currently working with Development Reimagined. It's an African-led development consultancy with headquarters in Beijing. And thank you so much for having me today. So, and I think maybe let's begin with the my kind of sharing point. So when we looking at Chinese financial engagement and tours with Africa countries, and we can maybe conclude with three basic types. So it's namely grants or aids, and also loans and foreign direct investment. And I think this is both from private and public sectors. So before I dive into my in detailed presentation, I want to firstly leave you with three numbers. So the first one is US 3 billion. The second one is US 7.6 billion. And the third one is US $33.8 billion. So a lot of you might be familiar with this data, and I know that Tiara has been working with Boston's University's data center. I think you might be very familiar with this data. So the first one, it's about the aid. So I think it's average grants to Africa from China per year. So the second one, 7.6 billion, is the average loans from China per year, and this data is between 2000 to 2020. The third one, 33.8 billion, it's average Chinese FDI stocks in Africa per year. And this is calculated within the 2003 to 2021. So I think maybe at your first mind that this amount of money can make a big difference, and based what we know that it has been make a big difference because of the way that they given. So for example, the grants have been used to build small and medium-sized social welfare projects and to find projects to cooperation in human resources development, technology, like technical cooperation, also humanitarian assistance. So there are also concession loans and also standard loans from China to Africa country to help them to build infrastructure. So at the first glance, you may think about like how big the data is, but in the reality is this number seems big, but actually in the reality is still quite small. So let me have a comparison. So for example, the total loans from China to Africa countries of the last 20 years, it's 160 billion. Or what I mentioned previously, it's about 7.6 billion per year. But this is actually tiny because our analysis estimate that Africa countries spend around 130 billion in last 2 years, or around 33 billion per year just in last 2 years to manage COVID-19. So my standpoint here, and also this is what DR has been advocating for a while, is about Africa's too little debt crisis. This means that Africa needs more finance, especially in the post-COVID-19 area, in infrastructure, in agricultural, and also maybe in renewable energy and in any other sectors that need to be developed to achieve African Union 2063 agenda. And I think BRI can definitely play a role in this. But before I jump into the BRI, I would really want to mention that, so usually when we're talking about loans or debt or investment from China, so one thing is always frequently mentioned by some narratives or by some analysis accuse China about using debt trap or debt diplomacy to hinder Africa's development. But our DR standpoint is that this is kind of a not true narrative. So for example, a 2018 study by Jubilee Debt Campaign shows that 48 Africa countries suggest about to study a 48 countries debt level and show that 20% of their debt owed to China compared to 35% to the multilateral institution and 32% to private creditor and the remaining 30% to Paris Club of Lenders. And also, China is willing to have debt cancellation and restructuring with Africa countries. And in the past, we find that, and also in the COVID-19 time, China has helped Africa countries to have this kind of debt restructuring and to help Africa countries to fill financial gaps and easier burden in debt repayment. So yeah, I think maybe I can now move to the BRI. So as like I mentioned, BRI can definitely play a very important role in linking Chinese like financing to Africa countries. And just very short, so BRI was proposed by President Xi in 2013. And this is aimed to improve connectivity and cooperation on transcontinental scales. So to date, 42 Africa countries and also African Union have signed the MOU to implement the BRI. I believe that there's only 2 countries, including Mauritius and also Switzerland. I think they didn't sign the MOU with China. So based on what we researched, we know that China does not impose any specific requirement on companies that are willing to participate in the BRI. So any countries from any countries that comply with the relevant laws and regulation and are aligned to the concept of globalization and the spirit of the BRI are generally able to and also encouraged to take part into the BRI. So, and I think on the one hand, that this is kind of very helpful to engage everyone that interested in BRI to participate. But on the other hand, it is also quite difficult to distinguish which kind of projects laid under the BRI. But there is no doubt that grants, FDI, and loans play an important role to implement BRI projects in Africa countries, given BRI as a very strategic like importance of Chinese foreign policies. And there's also one thing to thinking about or taking into account is about the foreign-owned China Africa cooperation, FOCAC. I think this is also very important when we look at like financial engagements with the 2 sides. So both BRI and FOCAC can well link to the African Union's Agenda 2063. and China's contribution to the AU's agenda has been significant. And I think preliminary development impacts on Chinese financial engagement with Africa really vary by countries and also by sectors. So I can quickly give maybe 2 examples. And the first one is kind of very frequently mentioned about the infrastructure sector. So for example, Chinese investment, both from private and public, has led to the construction of new roads, like ports and railways, expressways, highway, and buildings in Africa countries. And these are very important to improve the connectivities and regional engagement and also promote the trade. So I think the most straightforward feeling from my personal experience. So I'm right now based in Kenya, Nairobi, Kenya. So I think it's when I taking the expressway from out of the airport to the city, I think it's really save time because it avoids the traffic. And also like this is kind of important for some business if they need to travel very urgent time. And also Chinese companies build the highways linking Mombasa to Nairobi and also even to Uganda. So this is when I go to hiking. So I took that road and like my driver told me that this highway is actually built by a Chinese company. So I think this kind of highway linking the port and the inland and also inland countries like Uganda, and these are also very meaningful to promote trade. So another one is about the industrialization. So I believe most of you have read about the McKinsey's report. So they have studied them. There are more than 10,000 Chinese-owned companies like operating in Africa, like private sector business from private sectors. And this account for around 12% of Africa's industrial production. And when I stay in Nairobi, I have talked some Chinese business. So from like, they are very diverse, from small grocery store and some from logistic company and also some from large manufacturing factories. And I learned that they really also have a very important and positive impact to the local, and this including but not limit to increase value-added production and also job creation and on trade. So I think if I want to list every example for different sector, I can list, maybe take the whole hour to mention that. So, but I will just stop here. And to conclude, and one thing is very clear, that from our attracting on forecast commitments, including financing on other sectors, financing from China to Africa will continue to be available in forms of grants, loans, and FDI. And BRI is also not going away for Africa. And these are very both important for Africa's development and also address Africa's need. So I will stop here. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Ike. One quick question. So I wanted to invite you to speak just a little more thinking about our current moment, so recovery out of COVID and beyond COVID as well. China's been experiencing an economic slowdown and being a bit more careful or thoughtful about how they implement some of their BRI projects. If you could speak a little bit or share some of your thoughts about what this might mean for Chinese-backed infrastructure projects moving forward on the continent. And also maybe is any kind of efforts on the side of China to cultivate some of that original excitement about BRI that's now right a decade in the making.
Yeah, sure. I think maybe Tiara will have more data about like how China has been invest and also loans during the COVID time. But our research also know that there's kind of a slight decrease in COVID time about the Chinese investment and also loans to Africa countries due to COVID, because I think this is like the behind reason is combined, including travel restriction and also like Chinese own development, like domestic own development policy, etc. And also, but I think the important to know that, so even during the COVID, I think projects are also signed by two sides, and usually a project that really hit on the ground and happening, or maybe start to construction, is kind of a definitely need a long time to negotiate and then to implement and to start to build. So I think even during the COVID, like some projects are signed between Africa countries and China, and also maybe, I think, although like the maybe number of the project might decrease, but this is still not, doesn't mean that like the cooperation or financing from China to Africa has been stopped. So I think after the COVID, I think we also including like China opens the border, there's more people like travel around, and also including me. So I think I have been relocated to Kenya since January. So after China announced their like border like openness, so I decided to move to the Nairobi. And what I know that there's a lot of Chinese people, business people also start going outside, including especially in Africa countries, to explore more opportunities. And I think this is definitely something in the future. I think there will be more projects on the ground, more investment. And after, so even though when I in the Nairobi and I have communicated with some Chinese business, and they already have some exciting like opportunities in Nairobi, and they want more Chinese people to join their like cohort to have this co-investment. And I think this is definitely what will happen in the like the post-COVID time. And I think mostly like infrastructure project, I think it's still definitely one of the most important thing. Under the BRI, I think from my perspective, there will be more in the future, especially like 2023. It's like you mentioned, that is the 10th anniversary year starting from the BRI. And there will be no doubt that there will be have the more higher forum maybe this year to celebrate this. And I think, yeah, I think this is just kind of the trends in the future. There will be more projects like, yeah, after the COVID period.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Fike. Now we're going to move on to Winslow, who's going to speak to us about foreign direct investment, what gets counted as FDI, and perhaps how to sort of understand this against other large-scale infrastructure projects backed by China. So welcome, Winslow.
Thank you so much for the introduction, and hello, everybody. My name is Winslow. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. And yeah, I'm going to talk about this both as an academic, as a PhD student who studies this, but also as a practitioner, because I've been advising different organizations who want to invest in the African continent or interested in China in different capacities. And what ends up happening is that a lot of people end up misusing this word investment, because what they usually mean by investment, because FDI, foreign direct investment, has both a technical and a practical definition that both revolve around an entity from one country working with an entity with another country through maybe an acquisition or building something to make money over the long term. So that asset has to make money over the long term. And that seems perfectly reasonable and perfectly obvious, but the problem is almost everything that makes the news in terms of the China-Africa economic relationship is not that. It's usually engineering, procurement, or construction. And if you look at the definition of FDI, if you're a trade economist and you read Robert Feenstra and his ownership, localization, internalization of FDI, that would not be counted. But if you also look at the OECD, UNCTAD, IMF definition of FDI, that road built is not FDI. The port that's built is not FDI. If you look at the UNCTAD 2020 foreign direct investment report, they state specifically that a lot of these construction projects do not count towards FDI. Now, why does that matter? All money is the same, right? Well, not exactly. And so if you're a policymaker, if you're an academic, if you are interested in business, if you're interested in a whole range of issues, if you use the wrong word, you're probably going to pull the wrong data, and then your analysis might be problematic. And I'll give you an example. So let's say you're interested in Nigeria. Nigeria's in the news for a variety of reasons, and you're about to talk about Chinese investment in Nigeria. All right, well, how do you find that out? Well, one, you can go to Carry's incredible FDI database and pull up the data in Nigeria, and you find that maybe over the last, from 2017 till 2020, about 200 million of FDI in Nigeria in 2017, about 100 in 2018, about 200 in 2019, and about 300 million in 2020. So it looks a little steady, but kind of rising. And those numbers aren't that big sounding, because if you look at the loan data, if you go to Boston University's incredible database, and you look at the Nigeria loan data from the same period, if maybe you want to look at trends, in 2017 is about 1.8 billion in loans, in 2018 is about 900 million, in 2019 about 1 billion, and then 2020 zero. So why does that matter? Well, if you are somebody who is pressed for time, like a professor or a manager in a firm, or if you are a policymaker who can't manually read through a lot of documents and you just say, give me the numbers so I can make a decision, it looks, if you use the loan data, like China's not investing as much in Nigeria. And because if you consider a loan an investment, the numbers are going down. But if you use the FDI data, actually the numbers are going up. The issue is FDI is a lot less. These flows are not as big or as news-making as in other places. And a lot of databases basically confuse these loans for FDI. And you would maybe say, well, Wenzel, that's unlikely. I have seen things. I have seen things in the private sector. I have seen things in academia, in peer-reviewed journals. I have seen things. But basically, if you're a Nigerian policymaker and you want to encourage foreign direct investment from China, the FDI data says you're doing a good job. But if you're a policymaker and you use that loan data, or if you're maybe a business person, you want to work in or around how China engages in Nigeria, and you say, oh my gosh, China's not investing in Nigeria, you'd be misinformed. And also, one last thing before I close, in terms of how this language gets maybe confused sometimes, PEPFAR, which maybe a few of you are familiar with, if you look at PEPFAR's disbursements or obligations, not disbursements, towards Nigeria, if you compared PEPFAR, Chinese loan data, and FDI towards Nigeria specifically, so PEPFAR has obligated about 6 billion. In the same period, Chinese loans have obligated about 7 billion, and Chinese FDI is about 3 billion. PEPFAR is not FDI. Now, a lot of people would confuse with FDI, but a lot of folks would use the sort of language of Chinese policy bank funding or Chinese lending, whether it's development finance or otherwise, and count it as equivalent to FDI. And it really harms a lot of analysis. And I'm gonna stop right there and then let other folks talk. But yeah, this is I'm so passionate about this because I've seen this for a decade, and it's really one of the first things I tell clients who might want to maybe think, oh, China's investing billions of dollars in Africa. I want a piece of that. I want to be a subcontractor, or I want to maybe work in policy around and help guide that money. And the first thing I tell clients is that that's not investment. It's not a long-term relationship to manage an asset to make money, and that you, for a variety of reasons, won't be able to access it. All right, and with that, I will conclude.
Thanks very much, Wenzel. Sort of going off of sort of your closing statement there, right? The dominant narrative that tends to cast a lot of China-Africa relations is mainly government-to-government relations, right? That's what we see most prominently, especially in a lot of media coverage. I'm wondering if you could take just a few minutes now of your time and speak a bit maybe about some current trends about the Chinese private sector in Africa, things that speak directly to you that you're interested in, or just take a couple of minutes and share some of that with our audience.
Sure. So that's a great question. So there are an incredible host of Chinese private enterprises that are in the African continent, but don't make the news, or maybe might make the news for not always the best reasons. But these are folks who are they're risking their own money to go to a foreign market to make money. These are folks who are building factories to try and do things. And they might have maybe they tried to do something in Lesotho and it didn't work out, and then they swing by South Africa, it doesn't work out, and then they go to Nigeria. But these are folks who are entrepreneurs, who are the sort of folks that countries should be trying to attract. and trying to, and because the knock-on effects of foreign direct investment from these sort of projects are real and tangible. The issue, though, is that you're asking me in 2023, and truth be told, I'm not sure what's going to happen. So yes, the Chinese lending data from 2016 or even 2013, depending on your inclusion of Angola, the Chinese lending data towards Africa has been steadily decreasing. Doesn't mean China's not investing, but it means the loans that are powering a lot of this engagement, including private sector folks, because let's say you work in a Chinese state-owned enterprise, you think Kenya's amazing. After the contract's done, you said, I'm going to open a business here. And that network effect, that might not be as possible anymore. But on the flip side, the past few years have also made it that a lot of Chinese folks might feel that if they've ever wanted to open a business, maybe opening it in China might be a little risky for a variety of reasons, and they might be more amenable to take their money and to build a business in a risky environment. Truth be told, a lot of Chinese private investors aren't always a fan of Africa in comparison to other places. Usually they have very specialized reasons or very direct reasons for that market. And it is completely possible that the past few years have informed a generation of entrepreneurs that for the kind of risks they're taking, they might as well go to different African markets and try and do incredible things around the tech sector. Chinese social media influencers are really interesting. The biomedical industry and healthcare is actually something that I've been hearing a lot of folks on. A lot of green energy potential in around like Chinese electric vehicles, Chinese solar power production. There's a lot of really interesting high tech or things that might make the news that my own network of friends and entrepreneurs are telling me we might do this. The issue is I can't predict. I don't know what's going to happen. Maybe folks are doing this now, but in a few months they say, well, the past few years are kind of rough in China, but that'll never happen again, and we're gonna close up our factory and head back to a safer European market, or go back to China. I honestly don't know, and I wish I had a better answer.
No, that was a great answer. Thank you so much, Winslow. Perhaps we have time to talk a little bit more about this in the open forum. For now, we're going to move on to Terella, who's going to speak specifically to us about Chinese lending and debt distress, and maybe also a bit about how China is responding to some of those criticisms around engagement with different African countries experiencing debt distress. Terella, over to you.
Thank you, Vanessa, and I just want to thank the organizers for having me on this esteemed panel. Today, as I'll be talking, I'll be drawing from loan data, at least from our Chinese Loans to Africa database. This was a database that came to us from the China Africa Research Initiative. Since 2021, we've built upon that database. So I think first, to frame Chinese lending to Africa, it's important to start from the concept of supply and demand. From the African perspective, you see that there is a vast infrastructure gap, and the African Development Bank has estimated that on annual, Africa as a whole, as a continent, needs about $100 billion in infrastructure finance. On the China side, you've seen a supply of contractors who've been able to support infrastructure as well as finance throughout the developing world, but specific to Africa from 2000 to 2020. And so these two supply and demand trends meet together to materialize in this vast lending that we've seen from 2000 to 2020, where our database estimates that Chinese financiers have signed $160 billion in loans with African governments and state-owned enterprises. So when you look at this number of 160 billion, you see that there's a diversity of financiers as well as a diversity of borrowers. On the financier side, the Export-Import Bank of China and the China Development Bank have provided the vast majority of these loans. However, other lenders, such as commercial lenders, including the Industrial and Commercial Bank of China, and Chinese companies have also been prominent financiers on the continent. On the borrowing side, you see that the top 10 borrowers have taken 71% of this finance. So these borrowers include Angola, Zambia, Egypt, Nigeria, Kenya, and going all the way to Ghana. And so there is this diversity of at least financiers targeting certain borrowers, of diversity of sectors. However, these sectors have tend to focus on infrastructure heavy sectors such as power, mining, ICT, and transport. And so when we look at the impact of this financing, much of the research has shown, at least from a Dreyer et al. Paper, that generally Chinese finance leads to short-term economic growth in many of these countries. However, on the kind of the negative impact of the finance, we've seen, at least from our research center, that Chinese finance projects have had a harsher impact on the environment, especially for those large-scale infrastructure projects. So you do see benefits and risks to these finance. However, it doesn't negate the fact that it has contributed to kind of this building up of infrastructure. And just through basic economics, we know that infrastructure can help catalyze economic growth. And so when we look at the general trend of this finance from 2000 to 2020, as many have mentioned already, there has been a peak of this finance in 2016. If we remove Angola out of the mix, that has received quite a bit of the finance, you see that this peak happens in 2013, which was the year that the Belt and Road Initiative was announced. And so this decreasing trend has already been happening before the COVID-19 pandemic, but we saw that the COVID-19 pandemic appeared to exacerbate the trend, meaning that many African governments had a constrained fiscal space and were seeking to at least direct much of their kind of focus to social sectors and other sectors that were impacted by the COVID-19 pandemic, which constrained their ability to service their debts, but in some countries constrained the ability to take on more loans. I think Ika mentioned other factors such as travel restrictions and others that also impacted this amount of lending. In 2020, we saw one of the lowest amounts of lending of a little under $2 billion from Chinese financiers. At the same time, we have seen there's been a pullback from the China Development Bank in 2020 and 2021 from this lending, while the Export-Import Bank has continued to lend. However, that financing has been smaller in size and for smaller scale projects as well. At the same time, we've seen a display, or at least reports of a display of cautionary lending from the Export-Import Bank of China in places such as Uganda, Nigeria, Ethiopia, while the Export-Import Bank of China is also leading debt discussions in countries such as Chad, Angola, Zambia, Ghana, and Ethiopia as well. So in terms of the lending itself, we do see there has been at least a reduced capacity by many recipient countries to take on new loans due to high debt burdens, rising interest rates, and just limited space for borrowing in general, but at the same time, a proposal of new projects as we come out of COVID-19. And then we also see that, at least on the China side, we have seen current account balances return to previously high levels. However, there are many competing domestic kind of stimulus priorities that at least the policy banks, the Checksum and CDB have pivoted towards. We've also seen that generally Chinese firms now have had enough experience in African markets with the support of sovereign-backed loans, and now may be able to better invest on their own. And then I also just want to turn from lending to debt briefly to talk about the China-Africa debt story as well. So I just talked about lending, which again is just based on our data on loan signings. But in terms of debt, these are loans that have been dispersed already and are now coming to a point of repayment. The China-Africa debt story is quite interesting because on the whole, you see that African governments owe more to multilateral lenders and private sector lenders. And then that third creditor is China. And in relation to other bilateral lenders, China is the largest or bilateral creditor. But when you break this data down from country to country, you see that each African country has a different China debt story. So in places like Angola, Djibouti, and Ethiopia, they owe a majority of their external debt to China, while other areas such as Chad, Ghana, and Kenya tend to owe less to China and more to multilateral creditors and private sector as well. So generally, debt negotiations have taken place under the Debt Service Suspension Initiative during the COVID-19 pandemic and are now underway under the G20 Common Framework. And what we've at least seen from China is not this debt trap diplomacy narrative where China, has could potentially seize assets in the event of non-repayment, but rather we see China willing to provide extended repayment terms, lower interest rates, other types of debt deferrals, and in some cases cancel overdue payments on interest-free loans. And so in this very pivotal time, especially with undergoing debt negotiations for Zambia and upcoming negotiations with Ethiopia and Ghana, we see China being willing to be involved in in these debt negotiations and discussions, but there's still much to be seen in terms of the outcomes of many of these discussions. So there's a lot to watch from here, and I'll pause there.
Thank you so much, Torella. Going off of this last point of yours, Zambia was also at the forefront of my mind here. So, in your opinion, and in terms of the data that you've been looking at and the types of conversations you've been part of, how should we, or how might we think about sort of this this role that that China is taking in these debt negotiation or renegotiation talks, in terms of what that might tell us about their goals for future relationships with lending relationships with African countries? Is there anything about sort of the dynamics of these this moment of debt distress for different African countries and China's role within that renegotiation that might sort of demonstrate China's interest in sort of staying a long-term presence in these types of partnerships?
Sure. So I think the first thing to note is that the Export-Import Bank of China has been at the forefront of many of these discussions. And in general, from our data, we know that that has been where we've seen much of the lending come from on the Chinese financiers side, even though it's closely comparable to the China Development Bank. But the fact that, the largest lender is also at the forefront of discussions is showing that, okay, to some extent, there is a coordination going on that is supposed to be representative of the amount of lending that has gone to Africa as a whole. And I think that precedent itself could be set for many of other discussions relating to debt negotiations. In Zambia's discussions, at least, we have seen China also be quite intentional about making their stances be known, which they've been made known for a really long time, that the multilateral development banks as well as private sector creditors should take on losses in addition to bilateral creditors as well. And so there at least is an attempt to not just provide relief from the bilateral creditor angle, but see in what ways that other creditors that have historically not necessarily been as involved in taking losses in the most recent years can be involved in taking losses in the future. This, at least from the multilateral development bank perspective, this is an issue, meaning that if they were to take losses, it could affect their ratings, which could affect how much they're able to provide concessional lending at lower rates in the future. And so this has caused a stalemate for at least this discussion for Zambia, but I think the outcome of the Zambia creditor discussions could potentially have impacts for other ongoing discussions in Ethiopia and Ghana, but others that might come in the future. So we do see China, making a strong stance, taking their leadership there, the Export-Import Bank being involved, which could also then potentially mean that in the future, Export-Import Bank will continue to provide lending. It may be more smaller in scale, targeted, more sustainable, greener, to just address some of these risks that are emerging right now as we undergo some of these debt negotiations.
Great, thank you so much, Carla. Okay, and last we're going to move over to our fourth panelist, Marina, who is going to speak to us on the topic of aid and development assistance, and a bit about China's aid to the continent and how this has evolved over time. Thank you. Welcome, Marina.
Thank you very much, Vanessa. And thank you to the speakers before me of talking so much about the data and the figures and what is actually happening on the project base level. I'm going to talk a little bit more about policy and the broader context of Chinese aid, and was asked to speak also a little bit about how aid evolved over time. Now, looking kind of from the European perspective and being very much part of the Paris Club and the DAC debates, one thing that still comes up, which is surprising given all the work that has been done, is this question: how can China call itself still a developing country if it's giving aid? And the typical answer that we would give, well, it's been doing that since the 1950s, and not only China, India, for example, has also been simultaneously a donor and a recipient since the 1950s. And still in the Western geographies of give and receive, the image is still there. And this is something against we typically have to argue. So China has a long history of aid giving than many of the so-called traditional donors in the West. And more than that, China has actually been one of the largest aid donors since the 1970s. In early 1970s, China was giving about 2% of its GDP in terms of aid. And as you know, for the OECD, for industrialized countries, the target today is 0.7%, which on average 5 to 7 countries per year reach, like not even all DAC members. And as Deborah Bräutigam has argued in the early 1980s, when China was among the 20 least developed countries in the world, it was, according to OECD statistics, the 8th largest donor to sub-Saharan Africa. And this history and historical memory still plays a very important role in China-Africa aid interactions today, and in the symbolism of the interactions. For example, when Chinese leaders talk about Chinese aid to Africa, both domestically and when addressing African counterparts, they very often invoke the image of a shared past of joint anti-imperial, anti-colonial struggle, when China always aided Africa to the best of its ability despite its own poverty. This is a quote that we read in white papers, in official texts, and this is a quote we hear a lot in speeches. The Chinese side portrays cooperation with Africa always as based on friendship and mutual benefit, and also expresses gratitude for mutual African support in the United Nations. And this rhetoric is very pervasive. The China-Africa White Paper of 2021 mentions friendship 34 times and the term mutual 28 times. before Xi Jinping detailed in his address to the 2021 Forum on China-Africa Cooperation how China will support Africa. The word support occurred 11 times in his speech. He spoke about the long shared history of friendship and mutual benefit. In Euro-American debates, these references are often dismissed as just propaganda. And critical scholars highlight the gap between rhetoric and of equality and the power asymmetries in the relationship which exists, and explain specific and diffuse reciprocity with China's ability to coerce or corrupt recipients. And this rhetoric is undoubtedly employed strategically. And there is a link between aid and corruption that has been documented in the literature, but still it merits attention if we want to understand the relationship, because it has been fairly constant since 1950s till today, and is largely congruent with the language of the non-aligned movement and South-South cooperation movement till Bandung. And it's also playing out practically, for example, in the United Nations, where scholars using the databases that have been already mentioned in this forum have traced very significant correlation between Chinese aid and, to a slightly lesser extent, investment into African countries and the countries voting with China on topics of significance to the Chinese government. Now, China's bilateral development lending has increased very significantly in the last decade, particularly since the launch of the BRI. The exact volume and therefore the impacts of aid are difficult to assess, as the Chinese government does not fully disclose official figures. And this is compounded by the intertwining of aid, trade, and foreign investment, and China's treatment of state actors as commercial actors, like it is the case with the China Development Bank, which is difficult to distinguish between makes it difficult to distinguish between commercial and charitable flows. Now, from an African perspective or from a Chinese perspective, you could ask, but why should we? Because all of that creates a development impact. But this is the framework in which the DAC and the Paris Club, to a large extent, still operate. And this is very much impacting on the whole debt structure and debate we are having, and the question whether the CDB should be part of the debt renegotiation efforts or not. And I will come back to that at the end of my presentation here. Now, aid data estimates suggest that China's bilateral annual international development finance comes to be around 85 million US dollar a year, meaning that China outspent the United States and other major powers on a 2-to-1 basis or more. Yet only a fraction of that sum is official development assistance, comparable and budgeted in China as foreign aid. According to the Ministry of Finance, the foreign aid figure has remained stable at around 3 billion US dollar per year since 2019. Notably, this number is lower than the estimates by research group who gathered data on Chinese development finance through open access sources, which for 2019 have varied between 5.9 billion. This is by Kitano and Miyabashi, and 8.5 million by the Aid Data Project. The overwhelming share of Chinese official finance are project loans by the China Exim Bank and the China Development Bank, provided, as has been mentioned already, at preferential and commercial rates respectively, in many cases as resources for infrastructure swaps. Now, if we look at the distribution by projects, there we see quite a big difference between foreign aid and what could be counted as FDI. And if we look at FDI or project loans, the majority of development finance goes into transport infrastructure and energy infrastructure, and more recently also communication infrastructure. But if we look at foreign aid, the picture looks quite different. And there, the majority of projects are in the health, in social infrastructure and governance, and education. Now the question is, where does aid go to? And the typical assumption in the Euro-American space still is that aid goes to resource-rich countries, again, against the amount of evidence that has been provided by research groups. So resource-rich countries do not predominantly receive Chinese foreign aid, but rather where there is a clear correlation is, for example, the one China policy. Countries that do not recognize Taiwan receive aid, countries that do not. But this is in itself not surprising, because if you look at Chinese measures for the administration of foreign aid, it's stated that China gives aid to countries who have established with China. And obviously, if you have a diplomatic relationship with China, you do not have a diplomatic relationship with Taiwan. And the only exception is humanitarian crisis, which we've seen, for example, with Haiti, where China provided actually the largest contingent of the United Nations disaster response team, and Haiti at that time recognized Taiwan. A second major factor which determines where aid goes to is actually the political leaders' birth regions. And this is something aid data research has shown, that substantially large financial flows have gone to regions of origin of political leaders, and have been in part a consequence of electoral campaigns. But this again is something that we've seen on a broader stage, that infrastructure projects are often negotiated when there is an electoral campaign, because what better to win elections than with promising a road. But at the same time, the biggest criticism on China not delivering on its promises when it comes to infrastructure also happens during electoral campaigns. So in this way, China is being employed, and Chinese aid is being employed very clearly for domestic purposes. Now, this contrast between Chinese FDI and ODA and what is something that is also is playing out in the dialogue between DAC donors and China, especially when it comes to debt restructuring. The Paris Club and the DAC have been trying to involve China on aid for a long time. So far, China has refused all the invitations, but it has been part of the China DAC study group since 2009, and it's been observer in the Paris Club meetings since 2013. A possible accession has been debated in China on and off, with supporters arguing that joining would actually force China to improve its debt management and transparency, and also give China a voice in international agenda setting and rulemaking. But opponents argue that joining is not compatible with China's status as a developing country, and all the other Southern development cooperation providers also have not joined. At the same time, China finds the focus on Chinese loan in the multilateral debt structuring relief efforts, including in the 2020 framework, disproportionate and unjustified. And here, and this number is already also have been mentioned here, Chinese actors cite the World Bank's 22 international debt report, according to which 61% of debt composition of developing countries are private sector claims. 23% are multilateral creditors, and only 16% are bilateral creditors, with half of it being China. Other estimates are slightly different. The picture is slightly different for Africa, but still the majority are private creditors. And therefore, Chinese stakeholders has argued that the focus should be rather on multilateral institutions and commercial creditors. Nevertheless, the Exim Bank has been actively involved in debt renegotiation, as we just heard. But the biggest friction is how to treat the China Development Bank, and this is where the Paris Club and China are pretty much far apart, because the Paris Club argues that the China Development Bank should be treated as an official lender and kind of aid comparable, while the Chinese government argues that the China Development Bank should be treated as a commercial lender, because it's not subsidized by the Chinese government. And therefore, as long as Western commercial creditors are not included in the debt renegotiation efforts, the CDB shall also not be on board. And this is, if we look at the Western actors, this is kind of the main point of friction, because the definition of what is charitable, what is commercial, what is a state actor, what is not a state actor, are quite different between China and the DAC and the Paris Club. And so far, there is not yet an agreement to come up with common definitions. And I believe we need that if we look at Africa in depth. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Marina. I had one question that maybe you can spend just a couple of moments on in terms of thinking more regionally about the continent. And you alluded to this a bit when you said the false perception that development aid, Chinese development aid on the continent goes to resource-rich countries. In many ways, China does appear to have sort of an all of Africa strategy in terms of development aid, but based on sort of your research and some of the more recent data, do we see any specific focus on countries or perhaps sectors, development aid sectors, in terms of Chinese development aid, and what might that tell us, if anything, about sort of their strategy or their focus or concerns in the region?
So one sector which where we probably, have not been looking enough into, at least in Europe, this may be slightly different in the United States, is the whole telecommunications sector and generating value from data. This is a sector that has been largely ignored by Western companies, and where China is providing through mostly Exim Bank loans, whole packages for Huawei and ZTE and similar companies, not only to develop the telecommunications infrastructure, but to offer whole package smart city solutions or safe city solutions, which are criticized as being, a base for too closely observing your population, but are very reasonable for from the African point of view, because if you have a lot of violence and crime, you will be grateful for more surveillance because it makes places more safe. But the issue there is that China is establishing its own standards that are not necessarily compatible with European or American standards, which means, and this is something I was told by a European expert, that for Europe at least, the window to catch up is probably 3 to 4 years. And after that, the standards will become incompatible. Now, you could say from the African perspective, so what? If China provides us the infrastructure, that's not a problem. But one of the problems that I've been hearing from African stakeholders in my interviews is that actually the value that is generating from data is not happening that much in Africa, but it's actually happening in China, because the data is very often stored on Chinese servers. Big data then is used for improving the capabilities of Chinese companies. And African countries or African governments get the services, but they do not get the platform to create new added value from the data. And I think this is something we should be looking more closely into the future.
That's great. Very interesting. Thank you, Marina. So now we're going to move into sort of a Q&A format for our panelists. I'm going to propose just a couple of questions to get us started, but I want to take a moment and request that if any of our audience members have questions, if you could please use the Q&A function in the bottom bar on Zoom and type your question so that we'll have access to it that way. So we'll be taking questions from the Q&A chat feature on Zoom. So thank you again to all of our panelists. I had just two questions coming maybe from different sides that might speak to several. Each question might speak to several of your expertise, and so I invite all of you or any of you to sort of address these questions as you're interested in. So the first question, I want to think about sort of from the domestic side in China. And what we might know or questions we might have about that. So perceptions among Chinese citizens of China and Africa investments and also development aid. So maybe particularly thinking about this in the COVID recovery period, a period of economic slowdown domestically. What efforts has the Chinese government made to present to the public sort of investment and development aid to Africa in a positive light for a domestic perspective. And might that tell us a little more sort of about long-term strategy of these types of economic projects? The second question I had takes us more to the perspective of policy positions of African governments. So small businesses in Africa are impacted by Chinese imports and also in some cases direct competition. So how might African governments navigate this dynamic in terms of policy? So like what policy positions might African governments take and have taken in the past to address sort of this concern over competition, but also sort of the broader, the SME sector in general. So I'm going to open it up to Winslow, Tarella, Yika, and Marina, those two questions. And then I'll also be perusing the Q&A tab to compile some questions from there.
Sure, if you don't mind, I'll speak first. All right, so really quickly, the Chinese government for a long time has been trying to promote private sector or FDI in Africa for a long time, the China Africa Development Fund being a notable example. And it never worked, in that a Chinese government push to promote, because a lot of the Chinese policy bank lending or development finance or aid or whatever you want to look at, this is the Chinese government basically sending money overseas, usually for Chinese contractors, for Chinese goods and services. And at some level, there are risks. And it also risks over corruption or project capture. And different Chinese stakeholders are very aware of that. And they basically say, we don't want to use risky assets for these. We want you, Chinese individuals with money, Chinese nouveau riche, or Chinese entrepreneurs to go to the African continent, and we might try and help you out, such as the China Africa Development Fund. And broadly speaking, a lot of Chinese entrepreneurs didn't take to this Chinese state-led interest in private sector and investment. Now, it doesn't mean it doesn't happen, but the big projects, especially the China Africa Development Fund, which was looking to create sort of a vehicle for equity for Chinese entrepreneurs to go overseas, just didn't work. Now, right with COVID and the aftermath of COVID, there is a space of people of different sorts of entrepreneurs who are viewing African markets as inherently less risky than China, which means there could be an explosion of this happening, not because the Chinese government basically said do this, but instead because of their own volition, or the Chinese government opening borders allows people to make different calculations they did before. In terms of this policy implications for that, for a lot of African governments, I mean the policy implications is that, and so for the record, I believe Chinese foreign direct investment isn't particularly special or different. That the policy levers to attract Chinese foreign direct investment should probably be used to attract all foreign direct investment, or all even domestic investment, which is safety. A lot of Chinese investors are worried about issues of safety. But a lot of people in different African countries are also worried about issues of safety, hence the security state and apparatus. Currency fluctuations, currency valuation issues. If you take money in RMB and you have to move money around to send back home, things of that nature. And yeah, so safety in terms of crime, overall investment, climate, but the policy tools to attract these folks are going to work for anybody. They're going to work for Americans. They're going to work for other folks in African countries. And so in my experience, I'm not sure that the Chinese state can actually successfully encourage private investors, and I'm not necessarily sure that that African policymakers have to do anything particularly different outside of just, try to do the best they can in a very difficult, limited circumstances to just generate and foreign direct investment writ large, and Chinese folks will see that. But I'm more than happy to listen to what other folks have to say about this.
Yeah, thank you. I think I do have a question, not a question, maybe response to like Winslow's opinion, and also maybe sharing some perspective from myself as a Chinese. And like for some point, and most of like audience or maybe like panelists might know about Chinese like long time ago implements the going out policy. So going out, that it's encourage Chinese enterprises going overseas to invest. And I think this is kind of the one guiding like incentive from the state level. And because of this kind of thing, like the private sectors, like because the going out policy from the government to show the signal that the state like the government encourage private sector going overseas, this is kind of create a situation that there's a lot of Chinese company doing business overseas and including Africa. And I think so, and I think like it's quite interesting to hear that like it's quite hard from Chinese government to push Chinese companies have investments in Africa. But from my perspective, in the reality is there's a lot of Chinese private companies have an interest in Africa. So I have been like contact with a lot of companies such as creating solar panel companies, because like in China, has a well-developed supply chain in China about the manufacturing about solar panel. And they also see a good potential in Africa, like Kenya and like in Egypt. So like Chinese company has a strong, very willingness to going overseas to make an investment. And I think another thing need to pointed out is about the risky like environmental business environment. I think we need to like take into the two sides. So like for Chinese companies who have experience in Africa, they know how to do the business in Africa countries. They know what's the business environment. But for those who are not, who have not been engaged in Africa economics or countries, for some Chinese company, they have the concerns, they need information. And I think this is more important to linking the demand and the supply, so about the information sharing. So we need to provide an accurate like business environment information for different Africa countries and linking with Chinese companies. Like we know that like it's not kind of when private sector go into business, like they want to know the risky like level of the environment they invest. And I think this is definitely a point that need to be considered. But what Africa countries can offer is just to provide this kind of information. Sometimes Chinese companies don't want to go overseas in Africa countries because of lack of information. So I think the opportunity is there. And I think in China under the FOCAC, it's a lot of initiatives and also mechanism also have been in like promoting China Africa private sector investment. I know like under FOCAC, so have the private sector fund, so which also encourage like Chinese business going overseas, offering some information sharing, also provide funding. This is not from the state level commercial bank. This is all from the private sectors from Chinese. And I think in China, there's also have alliance like China Africa Business Council. They also do a great job to share information connecting Africa and Chinese business. So I think, I think this is kind of one thing to reply about the Winslow some opinion, but I'm really happy to hear different perspective, and also something that for me about my personal experience and perspective as a Chinese.
Yeah, I just wanted to jump in here with maybe some examples that could further highlight some of the responses to your questions. So at least on the domestic side, in 2022, we did see some policies come out that have been framed around greening the BRI. So we saw that China's National Development and Reform Commission issued some green guidelines to say that the Chinese government would actively play a role in improving policies to support green development along the BRI and establish an environmental risk prevention and control system. And in this document, it even encouraged private sector equity type investment to also come under this, new direction of making sure that projects that were being supported by not just policy bank finance, but also private sector finance would have this more greener tone to it. I think on the African side, when it comes to some policies that could be used to, I think, in a way, protect some industries or even protect certain employment or labor for really any foreign direct investment coming in, including Chinese foreign direct investment. I think of an example that was very interesting that happened in 2022, where the South African Labor Ministry said to the Chinese tech firm Huawei that it was not compliant with the country's employment policies. They wanted Huawei to meet the policy of having 60% of their staff be local hires, and according to reports, Huawei at the time was not meeting this percentage, and so there was a series of discussions and discussions around this, and where the South African government was holding this Chinese company accountable to its laws. And so I think with this example, especially as there may be, a shift to encouraging more of the private sector to come in through the FOCAC documents that Ika mentioned, and also this Green BRI guidance, domestic policy from the African government side is key, but not just policies, but an enforcement of that policy to the extent they want to make sure they're protecting some of these issues pertaining to their own economies and access to their own citizens in terms of being able to benefit from FDI investment.
Maybe just briefly to that before I respond to the domestic side in China. I think this is a very important point, that on the one hand, there have been several new policy guidelines coming out from the Chinese government on the Green BRI, on international standards in terms of sustainability, on corporate social responsibility. But all of that so far is voluntary. The Chinese government is not mandating companies to abide by that. And this, puts, unfortunately, the responsibility on African governments to hold China accountable to its own policy documents, because there is a substantial implementation gap with many companies. There is enough research out there showing that, for example, environmental impact assessments are done without involving local stakeholders. They are at best informed, but they are not really involved, which has often led to protests, which again, causes reputational damage for China, and where actually Chinese state stakeholders in countries can be an ally for African governments. And one example I have in mind from a recent study I did was actually on labor unions, where the Building Workers International union's subsidiary, I think in Kenya, originally wanted to organize in Chinese SOEs and wasn't successful with that. So they approached the Chinese embassy, and it turned out the Chinese embassy was helpful in bringing the Chinese SOE to the table, with the result, and then unionizing it happened. And this is something that probably, South Africa is obviously a big player, and smaller economies will have bigger difficulties than that. But holding Chinese companies accountable for the standards the Chinese government is setting out is something that probably needs to happen. And now on the domestic side in China, from studying both Chinese government documents and responses in the Chinese online sphere for a very long time, something that we can observe is every time the Chinese government makes a commitment for new aid funds or to support Africa in particular, there is a very strong response on the Chinese internet by Chinese netizens saying, why are we sending money to Africa when, you know, we have enough underdeveloped regions in China and we need this money at home. In parallel, funny enough, I mean, similar debates sometimes happen in Germany or in other European countries, although, you know, they're much richer on per capita. But this is something where the Chinese government has been always very carefully trying to respond through the white papers, through press releases, through informing the Chinese population about aid projects and showing that, first of all, this is part of China being a responsible big country and being a responsible power, but also communicating that this is an investment in friendship and that this is mutually benefit. But aid has always been a sensitive topic in China domestically, and it still continues to be that, probably even more so given that there is an economic crisis currently.
Thank you all very much. If you don't mind, we'll move to some of the questions that come from our audience. And I'll start with this first question that comes to us from Ignatius Anor of Voice of America. And any of the respondents, any of our panelists can respond to these audience questions. So the question for us asks, would you say that China must cancel debts for African nations facing debt distress because of the pandemic? Zambia was the first African nation to default on its external debts, and Ghana is currently facing its worst economic crisis in a generation. How critical would the cancellation be for these African states? Thank you.
I could try and jump in here first. So I think it's important to just say off the bat that the stall in many of these debt negotiation talks specific to Zambia is a concern. I think in order for the Zambian government to get relief from the IMF in particular, and you know, turn its debt levels back to sustainable debt levels. So I think it is important for cancellation to take place to an extent. And if that is not possible, which is showing that, at least from the Chinese perspective, there isn't a willingness to cancel that debt off the bat, that a level of debt restructuring needs to take place where there is a lowering of interest rates, a deferment, or a lengthening of repayment terms to make these debts, at least to give way for more relief from the IMF. So I think any type of debt relief is critical from China and other creditors as well in these discussions. And I think the stalemate that we currently have right now is going to be important to watch who's going to give in on at least the China stance, which is that multilateral development banks should be and private sector creditors should take losses or haircuts versus these banks and these banks saying that that's not possible, while the private sector creditors aren't really even involved in the room. So yeah, I think also just one thing to note in the Zambia case is that one of the things we recently researched is that it appears, based on reports from the Zambian Ministry of Finance, that loans backed by Sinosure, which is the export credit insurance agency, appear to also be up for discussion, according to the Ministry of Finance. And it's interesting that that inclusion was made because Sinosure also does provide insurance on China Development Bank loans. And so although China Development Bank has been excluded or has chosen to be omitted, China has made sure they're not necessarily involved in these discussions due to its claim of CDB as a commercial lender. It looks like if discussions were to fully go forward and there really is an inclusion of Sinosure-backed debt, China Development Bank debt will be included to the extent that there's insurance on that loan, on those loans. And so this is another concession that could add to that debt relief if cancellation is not possible.
I think I can also jump in and to add some points. And it's also about what DR has been argued for a while. So I think when talking about debt and so also like default thing, it's also need to think about the multilateral like debt systems. So we believe that current international loans market exclude or maybe penalize the poorest country like the Zambia in the world, and usually like the multilateral organization like the IMF, the World Bank, they have the like framework to have the debt ceilings, and also that like to understand this debt sustainability. And I think so because this kind of poorest country that mostly loans and are excluded from the loan market internationally, I think that's caused a problem. And I think even including the COVID-19, like just like mentioned, Zambia has been default, or maybe Ghana has facing the worst economic situation. And I think when we looking at Africa country, we also need to thinking about the international systems, if they are really helping Africa countries get what they need, like most importantly, the finance. And also when talking about debt, it's really important to keep in mind that it's about the quality of debt. So Africa countries need debt to develop. And also like there has a lot of regional projects and PIDA projects under the AU framework. They all have a very ambitious goals, but this developing this infrastructures need loans and also in other sides the debts to make the Africa country development. So yeah, I think I just want to add in something that about like multilateral financial systems or debt system. We also need to reimagine and rethinking about like how they can be really helpful for addressing Africa's financial situation.
And maybe just to add briefly to that, I think it shows just how different the perspective on debt is between the Paris Club and China. And what we've seen also in terms of Chinese voices is saying that China has been actually doing a lot by investing in productive infrastructure in Africa and investing in a way Western creditors have not been doing, and that this is going to pay off in the long term. So the timelines in which we see Chinese creditors thinking is a different one than we've seen with the European or American, and the assessment of, you know, when is a debt a bad debt and when not is a different one, and this different cultures of thinking is something that makes the negotiations at the moment very difficult, and so far that it's been pretty much a stalemate without actually looking at how do you come to common definitions.
Great. I'll if anyone else not cutting anyone off, I'd like to combine two of these questions. In the minutes remaining, we can try and speak to them briefly. So we have a question about Chinese engagement and investment in cobalt and other mining in the DRC. If anyone has any data or research on sort of current trends there that they want to speak on. And our second question comes to us about sort of taking us a bit of a longitudinal analysis, referencing here the Small is Beautiful report, Tarala, that you're familiar with. So our question says, China's overseas development finance seems to start declining starting in 2017. This decline happens before any African countries even join Belt and Road Initiative. What does this mean for Chinese ODF in Africa, especially in light of promoting BRI? So open that up to our panelists.
I can briefly jump in on the last question. Yeah, so yes, that is true that report shows that trend. While our Chinese Loans to Africa database, which includes development finance, but also finance from commercial banks and Chinese companies, shows a similar also decline where there's a peak in 2016 and a decline. So it's not just the development finance, but also commercial and commercial lenders and company lenders as well. I think in terms of what it may mean for Chinese ODF in Africa is that I think we will see a rebound to the extent that the projects will then be just smaller in scale, and the financing will be also smaller in scale with the exclusion of large regional projects, which have been talked about in the Forum on Africa, China Cooperation Dakar Action Plan as well. And so while we may see this rebound, but in smaller amounts, I think we will also see more of a diversification of financing tools, such as equity through what we term overseas development investment funds, such as the Silk Road Fund and the China Africa Development Fund, as well as other models of equity financing, such as build, own, operate, transfer models, which include equity finance involved, as well as financing to regional banks, in the form of on-lending to the African Development Bank that may come through the Checksum and CDB to give the finance to regional institutions that have already have a presence and kind of have a way to distribute the financing in a way that is able to take that finance necessarily off the balance sheets of Checksum and CDB for multiple sovereign lenders. So with that being said, I think, again, diversification of finance is something that we can expect for the BRI in Africa.
I think I can add something on that. So I think, yes, and thank you for like pointing out the decreasing Tara sharing about the Boston's database on some decreasing trends. But I think like we have talked about some like execution to Chinese like debt trap or debt diplomacy. And I think this is also have some impact on Chinese domestic side, including the lender when they thinking about to lend. So as we know that in some mega infrastructure projects from China, financed by Chinese lenders in Africa countries, and they are usually taking EPC contracts like a turnkey contracts like led by Chinese policy banks like China Development Banks and Import-Export Bank. And this usually involve a large amount of money. So because of this, like a lot of EPC contract, this also having some problems for Africa side, maybe related to like repayment and also other kind of factors taking into account. Now, I think Chinese state-owned enterprises, and I have knows like some power energy, focus on power energy when they are kind of diversify these projects in Africa. So they aim to move from EPC contracts to more PPP. So maybe they would love to engage more Chinese companies inside to have bring their investment. Also, maybe it's possible to working with local Africa companies and also Africa government. And I think so PPP side, so that doesn't require huge amount of money from maybe lend from the Chinese like policy bank. So I think this also something that maybe cause a decreased trends in the on the data. So yeah, I think this kind of some trends may be happening in the future that I can share.
Thank you, Ika. So unfortunately, our time is short, and I just want to take an opportunity to thank all of our panelists. Apologies if we didn't get to your question in the Q&A, but a big thank you to all of our panelists, and I'm going to turn it back over to you.
Thanks, everyone. I also wanted to give my warmest thanks to our panelists, Ika, Torella, Winslow, and Marina, for sharing their research and their insights on Chinese financing, investments, and development in Africa. We hope that this conversation has provided greater clarity on some often very controversial topics. And a special thank you to our wonderful moderator, Vanessa, for shepherding the panel so beautifully. I wanted to send a quick word of thanks to our colleagues, without whom this event could not have taken place: Professor Laura Smith, Marta Manzano, and Riley Anderson of African Studies, our colleagues in Asian Studies, Dr. Tom Banshoff, Toya Wulan, and Eleanor Albert of the US-China Dialogue, and Professor Krista Johnson and her staff at Howard's African Studies Center, and of course, the Henry Luce Foundation for their generous support for this series. Our final event for the spring term will be held on Friday, April 21st. Please put a pin in that date and keep your eyes open for further information on that last panel. Thank you to our audience for joining us and for your wonderful questions. Again, thank you everyone for joining us.